A warm welcome to Voice of Russia's political discussion program, Debating Russia. I'm Peter Lavelle. The handshake that, well, didn't happen. On the heels of Barack Obama's address to the United Nations General Assembly, it would appear Iran is still very much in America's crosshairs. Is it folly to hope that this will ever change? To discuss U.S.-Iran relations, I'm joined by my guests in London, Afshin Rattanzi. He's an award-winning journalist and novelist. We also have Popkin Azamir. He's an Iranian blogger and an opposition activist. In Tehran, on the line, we have Mohammad Morandi. He's a professor at the University of Tehran. And here with me in Moscow is Andrei Batkitsky. He's the project director at the Russian Center for Policy Studies. Okay, if I can go to Iran first. Professor Morandi, thank you for being with us. You heard President Obama's speech. Is there any reason why Tehran should have a charm offensive anymore?
Well, I think one of the important things that Dr. Rouhani is doing is that he's putting the United States government in a very difficult position, because up to now, the United States has been using previous President Mr. Ahmadinejad as an excuse to put pressure on Iran and to refuse any sort of reasonable rapprochement. Now, the United States no longer has that excuse. And President Rouhani, though, has said that he is quite willing to move towards better relations with the United States as long as the United States comes to recognize Iran's rights as a sovereign and independent country. So I think he's really, while the ball has always been, in my opinion, in the court of the United States, Mr. Rouhani has reaffirmed this in public opinion and in this global platform, meaning the UN General Assembly. So I think it will have an impact. Even if it doesn't have a great impact in the United States, it will have an impact on King countries and almost all non-Western countries in the way in which they view Iran and the United States.
Okay, Afshin, in London, I listened to both speeches very carefully, and I must say that the president of Iran, at least the tone was very different. It wasn't bombastic. My impression was that Iran is going to defend its sovereignty and its rights under international law, and I'm obviously referring to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. But I listened also to President Obama, and it could have been George Bush speaking, frankly.
Yes, I think many people around, certainly the developing world, will have been utterly shocked by President Rouhani's words at a time when we have a president that, as you say, in his UN speech, basically undermined the Nuremberg principle that the supreme international crime is waging aggressive war, and that's all President Obama was trying to do. At a time like this, for Mr. Rouhani, and presumably behind the scenes, the American-educated foreign minister, Mohammad Zarif, to try and encourage détente from a man who, around the developing world, is widely seen as a mass killer of men, women, and children using drone attacks, sponsoring de facto people like al-Shabaab, who killed all those people in Nairobi, let alone al-Qaeda-linked groups in Syria that have murdered so many. At a time like this, for the Iranian leadership to be pursuing this policy, I think many people around the developing world must be aghast.
Popkin, if I can go to you also in London, I said in my introduction, is it just folly to hope that there can be a change here? Because even if Iran says it's open to more transparency, which I would point out to our listeners, Iran has been amazingly transparent when it comes to its nuclear program, probably more transparent than any other country ever to sign the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Nonetheless, the onus of responsibility is still in Tehran's court. Is that fair?
Well, you asked about what's the reason for the charm offensive first, and I think for me the reason is obvious. The charm offensive is as a result of the sanctions. The sanctions are biting and the sanctions are having an effect, and Iran has to do something to get out of this situation. But I'm just not impressed by words, whether they're Obama's words or Rouhani's words. I want to see actions. And with regard to the nuclear issue, I mean, I never write about the issue of nuclear weapons, whether Iran wants to get nuclear weapons. I don't know. I have no evidence of what Iran wants to do with regards to that. It's not something that I'm an expert on either. But one thing that I want to say, you talked about transparency, and I think you meant with regards to the treaties and to the nuclear issues and all that. What I want to see is Iranian people being able to discuss the nuclear issue. I live in England and I can see people are free to discuss whether nuclear energy, I'm not even talking about nuclear weapons, put nuclear weapons to one side, just the nuclear energy, is it economically justifiable? Is it something that we should have? Is it dangerous? And there's no consequences for whatever opinion that you have. I want to be able to see Iranian people come on the streets and demonstrate peacefully, saying we want nuclear energy or we don't want nuclear energy. This is my concern.
That's a fair point, but why would external powers have the right to involve themselves in the internal affairs of another country? So let me pull in here, Andre.
Well, at least there's no consequences. If you speak against a gun lover, you're not going to end up in prison.
Let me have all my guests speak before we continue. Andre, if I can go to you sitting next to me. From a Russian perspective, when you're looking at the troubled historical relationship between the United States and Iran, do you think on the back of what's going on in Syria that Russians can, say, look, we're going down the path of trying to implement international law and make it apply to all? Do you think that this kind of nudges the United States, as we heard in the very beginning of the program, that, the United States is exceptional, but it's exceptional in ways that I think a lot of people don't like or wouldn't be proud of?
What I would like to stress that probably the United States at the moment are not that exceptional as they used to be, because as we've seen, besides the possibility to launch strikes whenever they want in the world, there's no willingness in the United States to do so, and Mr. Obama seen it, he has no support for the strike inside of the United States. When I'm saying about the strike, really in the first place, could they implement the strike? Could Obama pass it through the Congress? Not really.
But even if he did get permission from Congress, it would still be illegal under international law. And Professor Morandi, if I can go to you, back to you in Tehran, Iran's nuclear program was brought up by one of our guests in London. It's always been my understanding is that the Iranian people strongly support Iran's treaty right to develop civilian nuclear power. It's actually an issue that unites people, not divides them.
Well, if you look at polls carried out both by Iranian polling institutes as well as American polling institutes, throughout the years, the Iranian nuclear program has been quite popular in the country. And I would have to say that there is a large amount of debate in Iran about all issues on the blogosphere. President Rouhani had very differing views of the nuclear program than some of the other candidates during the presidential election campaign. I must say, and I firmly believe in this, that the presidential debates in Iran were far more interesting than the presidential debates in the United States. And I don't see the United States as showing that sort of diversity in the corporate media at all when it comes to key issues in the United States. For example, with regards to Syria, all the major news agencies, TV stations, and news outlets were more or less supportive of the position of the political establishment, yet the overwhelming majority of Americans were opposed to war. I'd also like to add the point that I don't think at all Dr. Rouhani's position has anything to do with the sanctions, because this was his position for years. I'm not saying that this approach is going to lead to results, but I do think the benefits of this approach is that it makes it very difficult for the Americans to behave as they do without paying a heavy price. Because up to
it's
now,
very interesting that you mentioned that. Afshin, if I can go to you in London, it's interesting in the lead up to the speeches of both the presidents and the General Assembly. I found it quite curious is that most of these people that call themselves analysts of Iran don't speak Persian, probably have never been there, but their primary source is the Washington Post and the New York Times. But it seems to me that, instead of saying the hardliners in Tehran, it's really the hardliners in Washington and other Western capitals that have tied Mr. Obama's hands when it comes to Iran after, almost 4 decades of an estranged non-relationship.
On the other hand, one has to say that, okay, people say the United States is weaker, it's a dying superpower because of the crisis in Western capitalism. We've got to remember, his national security advisor is Susan Rice, his UN ambassador is Samantha Power. These are people of the most hawkish, interventionist. Maybe there are lobby groups, ironically, saying to President Obama, don't launch a war on Syria, don't ratchet it up. I mean, America, perhaps involved in the assassinations on Tehran streets. And we must remember that Iran's own internal electoral politics, the reasons why President Rouhani was elected to do with the vagaries of runoff, according to some analysts, this is a very dangerous situation, and just because America, their electorates, and the analysts in these newspapers say the electorates don't want a war, we mustn't discount the fact that the U.S. uses special forces, uses ways to destabilize countries. And I think, the most important thing now is that just because we have supposedly neoliberal, and I haven't even started on the neoliberal economic reforms of President Rouhani that may be in train, they have to be very, very aware that just because there's no electoral mandate for intervention for Obama fighting more wars doesn't mean he's not going to start them.
You're listening to Voice of Russia's political debate program, Debating Russia. I'm Peter Lavelle. Okay, Popkin, go ahead, jump in.
Well, I just wanted to say that, you mentioned the American hardliners, and I want to emphasize that I'm not here to defend American hardliners. I'm not even here to defend American liberals or anyone in America. I want to make my country better. I want to make my country stronger and more prosperous. And sometimes to do that, you need to be able to criticize your government. You need to have different voices. It doesn't matter if even 5% of the population may think that the nuclear energy is not economically justifiable. That 5% should have the right to speak out without fearing the consequences of their statements.
Sorry, what does nuclear energy got to do with any of this?
Sorry?
What is nuclear energy?
Well, it was mentioned that Iranians are all united on this issue, so there should be no room for discussion.
No, it was said that the issue tends to unite people, not divide people. That was what was said.
Well, you can never say that 100% of the people are united. Even if it's 2% of the population, that 2% need to be able to say and speak their minds.
Okay, well, let's go back to the leaders' speeches in the United Nations. Pumpkin, if I can stay with you, Pumpkin, if I can stay with you, what would you had liked Obama to say? Did you like his speech? Did you dislike his speech?
To be honest with you, I only heard the headlines of his speech. I listened more carefully to what the Iranian president had to say. But as I said, speeches don't make any difference to me. I think to say something is very easy. It's actions that I'm after. And I want to see actions on both sides and judge world leaders by their actions, not their words. I've heard nice words mentioned by all sorts of world leaders.
Andre, if I can go to you, I read a number of accounts of it. There was supposed to be a luncheon with the two leaders, and after Obama's speech saying the same platitudes that we've heard for decades now, the Iranian president decided to pass it by because nothing new was said and there was no reason. I mean, there could have been a gesture. I agree actions are important, but gestures are important too. Andre?
Actually, I believe that the possibility of the meeting was not scheduled for Obama and Rouhani. But again, Iran is doing pretty much, and we're seeing the meeting of the foreign minister of two countries, which is unprecedented, and foreign minister of Iran participating in the P5 meeting, and sort of P5 meeting at the General Assembly. That's huge. And again, Secretary of State sitting there as well. At the moment, United States and Russia and Iran are seriously immense in Syrian problem. And while Russia and the United States are trying to sort of, get out of this thing.
But that's one of the things I'm trying to get at, and going back to the actions are important. Here, Russia pulled Obama's chestnuts out of the fire, as we say.
Well, yeah.
Okay, yes, and now we have another situation, a major country in the region, Iran, in dealing with Syria. Again, that is a way to start working together. You don't have to agree on everything. But I don't see that happening. I didn't see Mr. Obama say, we should have Iran sitting at the table to start Geneva 2.2. Professor Morandi and Tehran, I don't want to go too far away without forgetting you. Go ahead. You said you wanted to jump in.
Well, a number of things. I mean, with regards to the nuclear program, again, I'd just like to add that there's a lot of debate in the country. I'm a full-time professor at the University of Tehran. We have debates about everything, discussions about everything. It's very different from the sort of stereotypes that you hear about Iran in the Western media. And as I said, the best way to do it is to go to YouTube and look at the presidential debates in Iran and compare them to the presidential debates in the United States.
Were any of them against nuclear energy, saying that it's not cost justified? Any of the 8 candidates against nuclear energy? We were given 8 candidates to vote for, right? We were told these are the best people that you can vote for. They had to be approved by the Guardian Council. Was there a candidate to stand saying, I'm against nuclear energy because it's not cost justified?
The question, gentlemen, the question has been asked. Professor Morandi, would you please respond?
And none of the presidential candidates were against the nuclear program, and I'm not against the nuclear program. But they had different views on the nuclear program and how to pursue it and how to pursue diplomacy.
But don't you think that the Iranian people should have had the choice to have at least one candidate who offered that point of view?
All right, gentlemen. All right, gentlemen, go ahead, Professor Morandi. Professor Morandi, please finish your point.
In the United States, none of the presidential candidates were opposed to punitive sanctions against ordinary Iranians, which are killing women and children on a daily basis because of a lack of medicine.
There's articles in the American newspapers against the sanctions on Iran all the time. People talk about it. It's debated.
I think your impact is revealing. Let me continue, and then you can respond. I think that when one looks at the state of affairs, a country like Iran, which is under constant threat from the United States and its allies, military threat, a country which is going through the most severe sanctions in recent human history, and a country that is being punished by the United States through proxy and by dictatorship allies like Saudi Arabia through the spread of extremism in Afghanistan and Syria and so on, that the country is doing quite well. The United States, on the other hand, has no threat to its borders. No country is threatening any of America's interests across the globe. Yet it's when Muslims in the United States, one of my own friends, Sayyid Mahmoud Mousavi, simply because he supports Iran, he was arrested. He was held in solitary confinement in the United States for 1 year. You can look him up. His family has a website. He was in jail for 4 years. The IRS helped to frame him, and after 4 years, they were forced to release him. And he has lost his tongue. He had to operate and remove his tongue because of what he went through in prison in the United States. But these things don't get any coverage in the mainstream.
If I could just say something, Professor Morandi,
okay, please.
Over here they ban entire TV stations in Britain. They sack the Director General of the British Broadcasting Corporation not once but twice in my lifetime for opposing British policy. The idea that in this country where they ban TV stations, they...
But you think they have free TV stations in Iran?
Services.
You think you can come onto the streets and make reports in Iran by foreign TV stations?
Even broadcast TV stations across the globe.
And Iranian people can't watch satellite TV stations because they get signal jamming.
Gentlemen, please. Gentlemen. All right, gentlemen. Again, okay, Pumpkin, if I go back to you, you may have valid points. But why should the United States and its allies make that an issue about what kind of the state of society is in Iran? And isn't that an internal affairs issue? Because the United States will, even if Iran, and people say this, and many experts inside the Beltway, it's not about nuclear weapons, it's about regime change in Iran. Do you support regime change in Iran?
Professor Morandi talked about the external threats to Iran, and obviously I don't want any external threats to Iran. I actually think by becoming more democratic, we can reduce that level of being threatened. I mean, he correctly says that, now it's more difficult for America to threaten Iran militarily because of Rouhani, as a result of Rouhani replacing Ahmadinejad. And I quite agree with him. And the more democratic we become, if we continue this line, it'll be even more difficult for external powers to interfere in Iran. I don't want external powers to interfere in Iran. But I think the way to do that... I'm sorry?
What does it have to do with that? What does the greater democratization of Iran, should it be part of American policy or British policy or any other country's
policy? Well, you should ask that from a US politician or a British politician. I'm not here to defend UK or US foreign policies. I'm here arguing as an Iranian citizen.
It's the oil, I think.
Sorry?
It's the oil.
Okay. Well, whatever it is. Look, Russia's got foreign policy mistakes. Russia's got foreign interests.
What's Russia have to do with this conversation right now? Afshin, if I can go to you. I mean, if democracy is the issue here, then the United States and Britain should force democracy on Saudi Arabia.
Yeah,
would you agree?
I mean, the very idea that these countries, Britain and America, that have special forces supporting Al-Qaeda-linked groups in Syria that have killed so many people, the very concept of these governments which surveil their populations to the extent that we have the Brazilian president of the UN General Assembly, screaming her head off saying what on earth is going on in Washington. The idea that these countries can lecture anyone on democracy and human rights is plainly absurd. Leave these countries to develop in the best way they can. They are some of the richest countries. They are the superpowers of tomorrow with their energy resources. As to nuclear things, of course, they should probably have solar. But I think all countries now, they're prepared. And there is, of course, in the background, the idea that any country that is trying to pursue an independent foreign policy path needs the weapons to be able to defend itself.
You're listening to Voice of Russia's political discussion program, Debating Russia. I'm Peter Lavelle. Okay, Popkin, go ahead, jump in.
I have to say, I quite agree with Afshin on this point. I think we were actually discussing this before the programme started. I actually see Saudi Arabia as a very big threat. I think their extremism and the terrorist units that they support throughout the world is a big threat to everyone's freedom. And I think this is something that's not a point of contention between me or Afshin or Professor Morandi. I think we all agree on this.
Well, maybe I can find something where we disagree here. Professor Morandi, if I go back to you, because it's a debate program, I mean, I'll say what a lot of people don't want to say in Western media, and particularly in the United States, is that America's Iran policy is driven primarily because of Israel.
Yes, of course. I mean, there's no doubt about it. The nuclear program, human rights, and all that is simply nonsense. The whole issue is because Iran believes that Israel to be an apartheid state, the equivalent to apartheid South Africa, and the Iranians believe that there is no chosen people, and Zionism is racism. That's the Iranian position. You can agree with it or disagree, but that's been the Iranian position for 34 years. Iran has never, despite all the statements and propaganda in the Western media, has never called for Israel's destruction through military means. It's called for it to cease to exist as an apartheid state. And that has basically been the main problem that Israel has had with Iran. I'd like to, and the United States has had with Iran, but I'd like to add one other thing, and that is that as your other guests have agreed upon, I too agree that the United States is not after democracy. I don't believe the United States is a democracy, by the way. As Chomsky said, it's a single-party state with two factions. But I don't want to be misunderstood. I don't believe that President Rouhani decreases the threat of American military strikes on Iran. Personally, I don't think that the United States is in that sort of position because it would pay a very heavy price. And after Syria, I think what happened in Syria was a great thing for humanity because for the first time, American public opinion really stood up against Washington. And basically, it was the American people who forced the government to behave more rationally after the Russian proposal. But I do think that while I'm also concerned about some of President Rouhani's economic policies, especially as capitalism is being questioned so much, and I don't think enough questions are being asked right now in Iran about that. But I believe that the foreign policy that he's pursuing is principled. I think that his speech at the UN was very firm about Iran's rights, but also he was showing the world that, look, we do not have clenched hands. We never did have clenched hands, but now it's time to show the world whether Washington and the United States is truly after improving relations, or was this simply an excuse up to now to keep intensifying confrontation against Iran, and primarily that was because of Israel, as you asked earlier on.
Afshin, if I can go to you in London, I mean, does the Americans have any initiative here to change their policy? Obama's hands are tied. If you look at the last few months of his presidency, it's been an utter catastrophe. I mean, left and right, and now we have the budget crisis coming up. One has to wonder if these wars can be funded anymore. But what incentive does Obama have, or does he have any incentive to change course? I mean, American society, I can't speak so much for the UK, but Americans have just been brought up to hate Iran. And it's just as simple as that. Absolutely. A poll came out in Britain just this morning, I think, about how young people here hating Muslims. Yeah, that all goes on. I really don't think that because, I mean, Professor Morandi, in a sense, contradicted himself because about this democratic nature of U.S. society, I really am not quite convinced that because the American electorate, or there's a majority of the American people against war, that somehow within the United States system ties Obama's hands. I certainly don't think that we should all be relaxed about intervention against Syria, because after that General Assembly speech, Obama was very clearly saying to the world that, no, his finger's on the trigger. He can't wait to bomb Damascus, Aleppo, Homs, and all the rest of it. So, and as for deals on Capitol Hill, because of the budget, because, of course, the government shutdown is coming up, they could easily, the hawkish Republican right and the Dixiecrat, Henry Jackson-style Democrat left get together and cabal together and make Obama blackmail him using the budget, let alone his Obamacare stuff, to go through with another policy. I just wanted to very quickly say about that economic policy in Iran. You know, I left Iran just before the so-called green protest and stuff. And what worries me, that at least under Mr. Ahmadinejad, I think the poor of Iran knew that they had someone that they could kind of support. What terrified me and disturbed me when I lived in Tehran was the sound of Lamborghinis and Ferraris revving around North Tehran.
whilst the south of Tehran just didn't, I mean, it's a big city. But whether
So
it
who
be
was driving
Shiraz,
the Lamborghinis? The official
whether it
sons
be
and
Isfahan,
children?
Well, whether it be Shiraz, Isfahan, or Tehran, the disparities of wealth were noticeable to me. And it's difficult to explain how rich the rich are in Iran. I mean, this is a country with the largest car industry in the Middle East. Again, the way it's painted to American citizens, I don't know, they probably think it's like Afghanistan, I don't know.
Andrei, if I can go to you here in Moscow, do you think that at least as we speak right now, their foreign policy victory related to Syria can step up and play much more of a mediator between the United States and Iran? Because it's certainly, if they go to the General Assembly, the United States will lose the vote like Obama loses the vote in Congress. But I mean, a country that Russia has very good dealings with Iran, has also been involved in sanctions, but it's still a country that Iran can speak to, still has a trading relationship with.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm sure that Russia will step in and give in more talks, because really, at the moment, the more cooperation in the Middle East, the better for everybody at the moment, because I don't think that the United States has any clear vision or clear strategy what to do, even in Syria, as we've seen for the last couple of days. And really, what is important for Russia, and what Russia reiterates, that everything should be settled according to the international law first, and by the mutual consensus.
Okay, I'm going to jump in. We're almost out of time here, Poppy. And if I want to go to you, what do you hope and expect from the new president of Iran?
Well, Israel was mentioned in this, and again, I don't want to defend Israel's policies, but I just want to point out one thing. During the invasion of Gaza by the Israelis, there were Israeli citizens demonstrating against the war, and nothing happened to them. At the same time, Mothers for Peace in Iran came out on the streets demonstrating against the Israeli invasion of Gaza as well, and they were smashed up within minutes. And I want to point out one of the strengths of Israel is this democracy, and by us having democracy, we'll be stronger as well. We shouldn't fear this. This is not something that most political prisoners in Iran are charged with action against national security. Democracy is not against national security; it's strengthening the national security.
Israeli democracy. That's singing the praises of Israeli democracy.
Well, I'm sorry if you don't like it, but it's true. They could come out on the street and demonstrate against the Gaza war. Mothers for Peace got smashed up in 5 minutes. They were saying exactly the same thing as the Iranian government was saying, but they were not controlled by the regime. That's what dictatorships don't like. Look, I just said I don't want to. I just said I'm not defending all of Israel's foreign policy or internal policy or whatever. I'll point to that one aspect of their strength. I'll point to that one aspect of their strength, which is democracy, which is good for everyone.
Professor Moran, do you have the last word?
Well, I just want to disagree. I think what was just said was of course misleading. And again, Israel is definitely not a democracy. Of course, if you want to consider white supremacist apartheid South Africa as a democracy,
Iran is a religious apartheid.
Israel is a democracy too. But to compare Iran and Israel is really, I think, extraordinary. I mean, there's no comparison. Iran is not a racist state, and Iran had free and fair elections.
But it discriminates against people because of their religion.
There was a turnout of 73%, something that you don't even see in Europe, which considers itself to be the cradle of democracy. If the vote in Iran didn't count, if it didn't have meaning for people, there wouldn't be such a high turnout. People are not foolish. So
all right, gentlemen.
People have to use that narrow window that you present to them for the best results. That's why people turn out, you know it.
We had a good debate. And that's the whole point of the program. I want to thank my guests in London, Afshin and Popkin, and I want to thank our guests on the line, Professor Morandi, and my guest here, Andrei, sitting with me in Voice of Russia studio in Moscow. You've been listening to Voice of Russia's political debate program, Debating Russia. I'm Peter Lowell. Thank you, and stay with us. At the University of Tehran. And here with me in Moscow is Andrei Bakhitsky. He's the project director at the Russian Center for Policy Studies. Okay, if I can go to Iran first. Professor Morandi, thank you for being with us. You heard President Obama's speech. Is there any reason why Tehran should have a charm offensive anymore?
Well, I think one of the important things that Dr. Rouhani is doing is that he's putting the United States government in a very difficult position, because up to now, the United States has been using previous President Mr. Ahmadinejad as an excuse to put pressure on Iran and to refuse any sort of reasonable rapprochement. Now, the United States no longer has that excuse.
And I must say that the president of Iran, at least the tone was very different. It wasn't bombastic. My impression was that Iran is going to defend its sovereignty and its rights under international law, and I'm obviously referring to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. But I listened also to President Obama, and it could have been George Bush speaking, frankly.
Yes, I think many people around, certainly the developing world, will have been utterly shocked by President Rouhani's words at a time when we have a president that, as you say, in his UN speech, basically undermined the Nuremberg principle that the supreme international crime is waging aggressive war, and that's all President Obama was trying to do. At a time like this.
A warm welcome to Voice of Russia's political discussion program, Debating Russia. I'm Peter Lavelle. The handshake that, well, didn't happen. On the heels of Barack Obama's address to the United Nations General Assembly, it would appear Iran is still very much in America's crosshairs. Is it folly to hope that this will ever change? To discuss U.S.-Iran relations, I'm joined by my guests in London, Afshin Rattanzi. He's an award-winning journalist and novelist. We also have Popkin Azamir. He's an Iranian blogger and an opposition activist. In Tehran, on the line, we have Mohammad Morandi. He is a professor.
And President Rouhani, though, has said that he is quite willing to move towards better relations with the United States as long as the United States comes to recognize Iran's rights as a sovereign and independent country. So I think he's really, while the ball has always been, in my opinion, in the court of the United States, Mr. Rouhani has reaffirmed this in public opinion and in this global platform, meaning the UN General Assembly. So I think it will have an impact. Even if it doesn't have a great impact in the United States, it will have an impact on Asian countries and almost all non-Western countries in the way in which they view Iran and the United States.
Okay, Afshin, in London, I listened to both speeches very carefully.
This, for Mr. Rouhani, and presumably behind the scenes, the American-educated Foreign Minister Mohammad Zarif, to try and encourage détente from a man who, around the developing world, is widely seen as a mass killer of men, women, and children using drone attacks, sponsoring de facto people like al-Shabaab, who killed all those people in Nairobi, let alone al-Qaeda-linked groups in Syria that have murdered so many. At a time like this, for the Iranian leadership to be pursuing this policy, I think many people around the developing world must be aghast.
Popkin, if I go to you also in London, I said in my introduction, is it just folly to hope that there can be a change here? Because even if Iran says it's open to more transparency,